Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com.
Today we're going to take a look at the Magnates, a game of power from Phalanx Games. And as a side note, I will say right here that while the artwork on this box is really gorgeous, I am incredibly intimidated by the Polish-Lithuanian warrior king on the front, and he just makes me feel like less of a man. But moving on, this is an area control game that sort of simulates the time, I'm sorry, I'm not totally familiar with what years it is, but somewhere between like the 1500s and 1700s, a time of the sort of warring estates in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a period of time that I was really not familiar with and I'm only still vaguely familiar with after having played the game, although this definitely is a historical game. Each player takes control of a different noble family who is vying for power in all the different countries that make up the Commonwealth. You're trying to get seats on the Senate, you're trying to get different events and privileges to work in your favor, and then you're trying to defend your estates from warring or invading foreigners. And you all have to work together with the other players in order to do this, but of course there is some diplomacy and backstabbing that might happen at that point. Let's go ahead and take a brief look at how the game is played, then we're going to come back. I'll let you know what I think. Alright, so this is a general setup for the Magnates. Each player is going to have one of their player pawns over here on the round order track. You'll do this randomly at first. You also have these 4 king markers. Now these are going to be randomized as well. They show some of the different Polish-Lithuanian kings throughout history. Now each of them is going to be different because they're going to be keyed into a different seat of the Senate. You'll randomize these so that as you go from round to round, you're not going to know which king associated with which Senate seat is going to be coming up. And indeed the game is going to take 4 rounds. That is one of the other primary reasons you have these king tokens. You'll flip one up, say "Long live the king" at the start of each round, and then there you go. Now you also have the Senate cards out here, and that's one of the first phases of the game. You have cards like the Treasurer and the Primate, which is not the kind of primate you're thinking of, the Hetman, and the Chancellor. Now each of these has a different special ability that you're going to have access to should you be able to gain that seat, and I'll explain a little more about what those are in a little bit. So for instance, the Chancellor here, should you have access to this card, you can play when resolving a privilege card, your family card's influence is increased by +3. Also up here you see that there's a symbol that will match up to, this is the Chancellor symbol, so that would match up to the particular king should that arise. And also up here, this is the symbol for an estate, meaning that when you take this particular type of Senate card, you are going to gain an estate, and if it happens to be that type of king, you may gain an extra estate as well. Now you might ask, what are the estates? Well, they are actually, let me put this back here, they are these little tokens here, which these little type of meeples. These represent your estates, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to put these out onto the map in order to gain dominance, either a clear majority or just a just having more than the other players out on. Well, I'll explain more about that in a second. But you're trying to have as many of your estates out on each of the different countries on the map as possible in order to gain the most amount of points at the end of the game. And each player is going to. This assumes a 5-player game. Each player is going to start off with an estate out in one of the different countries. You also have smaller countries here known as fiefs, which you can gain extra points for, but you won't start off there. Only certain events are going to allow you to bring those out. These pieces here are going to be brought out depending on different combats and privilege cards that may be used. These are going to modify the power and influence in, or just power out in the different countries. So these might, pieces like this might actually lower the power, whereas these fortresses and castles will increase the power. And then sometimes there's going to be conflicted areas. Whenever conflicts can't be resolved, you need to put these meeples out, which are actually flames. Believe it or not, I know it looks like an orange castle, but these will indicate a partitioned area. I'll get back to that in a second. Each player is also going to start off with their own set of cards representing their family. Now, mechanically speaking, these cards are going to be the same for every player. They're going to be cards that are numbered from 1 to 14, but the artwork and the flavor text on them are going to be different. But other than that, they're all the same. And these indicate either influence or power depending on how they're used. The only exception to that is the 10 card. This card is used for 10 influence during the Senate and the Sejm phases when you're trying to get privilege cards, but it's only one, that's for influence, but it's only one power if it's used for a conflict. But otherwise, all the other cards are interchangeably either influence or power, depending on how they're used. Everyone's going to have the same essential set of cards in order to use for an entire round of play. Alright, so like I said, there's going to be 4 rounds of play. When you get to the start of a round, you're going to flip over one of the king tokens, and then the first phase that you're going to go through is the Senate phase. So each round is going to be broken up into these 3 different phases. The Senate phase is where players are going to take those family cards that they have, and they're going to take one card secretly from their hand and place it underneath 3 of the spots, just 3 of the 4. Now you can put any card that you want out there, but what you're trying to do is that once each player has placed a card, you are going to flip them over and see who has the highest number. So let's say that the red player goes ahead and plays, and the red player decides to play there instead. We'll just say this is for a 2-player game. And then you decide to go on these spots. And I'm just kind of doing this randomly, but just to show you an example. So once every player has finished playing out their 3 cards, and you must play 3 cards whether you like it or not, then you flip over the cards and see who has the higher numbers. And that's actually a great example right there, because that was a tie. Now over here we have clear winners. Now assuming that there was no one else contesting these spots in a 3 or 4 or 5 player game, then these players would take these Senate cards automatically. The blue and red player would just get those respective cards. Here the 12 beats the 11, so the red player is going to gain the Chancellor card. And then over here we have a tie. Now ties are actually generally going to be broken by the primate, but if the primates, or the primate, I'm sure there's a better way to be pronouncing that, but if the primate is not actually in possession of a player at that point, then ties are going to be broken by turn order. Whoever comes further back in the turn order is going to be able to break that tie, and then that player is going to be able to take the card. Now, once this happens, remember that I said before that each Senate card is also going to give you an estate as well. That means you physically get to take one of your estates and put it out on the board. Now, whenever you're putting estates on the board, and this is going to be true for the rest of the game, you have to check whether you have just advantage or dominance. So let's say that this is the setup for a 3-player game. Now, blue has more estates than either the yellow or the white player in this particular country. That means the blue player has advantage. That means that that player technically controls that province, but doesn't have a total majority, does not dominate in that region. But if the blue player had more than the sum total of all of his opponent's estates, then the blue player would have dominance. And what this means is that at the end of the game, you're going to gain more points if you have dominance as opposed to if you have advantage. So it is something to be striving for during the course of the game, although you'll still get points just for having estates out in all the different provinces. Now, going back to the different phases of play, once you've resolved all of this and all the players have taken or not taken estate cards the Senate cards as it might be, your players will take those cards, put them in front of them. They now have access to those special abilities, and all of these cards are going to go back to their respective players, but they're going to go into their own personal discard pile. They cannot be used for the rest of this round, and you won't get them back until the start of a new round of play when a new king has been declared. So the next phase of the round is the Sejm phase. This is where you're going to put out these privilege cards out into the Sejm area, which happens to be the same area as the Senate. That's the easiest place to actually do this card play. And these are more cards that you're going to be vying for control of, and you're going to do it in the same exact method. Each player is going to take the remaining family cards that they have, and you're going to put them out. You're going to put, in this case, one card on all 5 privilege cards vying for control. Again, even if you don't particularly want one of those different cards, you still need to put a card next to it. So if you don't want it for some reason, if you want to save your cards for the last phase of the round, then you might just go ahead and put a low card there instead. Now, first off, these cards all do the same thing as the Senate in the regard that you're going to be able to put out more estates. And sometimes it's more than just the one estate, and sometimes it's none. So in this case, if you win the Jesuit Schools privilege card, you're going to be able to put out 2 estates in one of the territories. And notice here, these are also keyed in to whoever is the current reigning king, so that can also give you a bonus estate as well, just like the Senate cards. And the privilege cards often have some dramatic effects. So in this case, the Jesuit School says that when you play when resolving a Senate or a privilege card, your family card's influence is increased by +1. Just as another example, now this here, the Constitution of the 3rd of May, 1791, actually is keyed into all the kings. So you're going to get an extra estate just for having picked up this card. And your wealth is increased by 5 for having this card if all provinces are on partition. Now what that means for the layman is wealth is essentially victory points at the end of the game. You get +5 if at the end of the game all the provinces are not embroiled in conflict with the partition markers down on them. And I'll just show you one more here. We have the Versailles of the North, which gives you an estate, and you play this during the resolution of the Treasurer card. Your family card's influence is increased by +10. Now, the reason for that is because in order to actually make use of this card, you need to be the Treasurer. You need to have taken that Senate Treasurer card. Now, you can still win this card even if you don't have it, but just to keep it away from whoever got the Treasurer or Senate card. But that Treasurer is the one that's going to get the most use out of it. That's just some example of some of the privilege cards. So again, just like with the Senate cards, you're going to be using your family cards in order to gain control of those. Now, the last phase of the round is conflict. There are these spaces all around the board keyed into each of the different provinces, which are spaces that the combat cards, the conflict cards, are going to go into. How this is going to work, you have a deck of these cards, and you're going to keep drawing cards until you have 5 conflicts out on the board. Each conflict card is going to be keyed into a particular color, so this is actually the yellow color, so we'll just go ahead and go over there then, just to make it easy. So that would be for the yellow country. I'm sorry, I don't remember their names. That would be Ruthenia. So that means that card is going to go into the upmost spot. You're going to always go into the lowest number there first. Now, if it so happens that you keep drawing cards and you don't have 5 yet, and you draw cards, and those the spaces for a particular color are already full, you'll just shuffle them back in and keep drawing until you have 5 conflicts out onto the board. So it might be uneven. It might be in different countries. It's going to change all the time. Now, the important bits of information on these conflicts cards. Let me just show you another one of them here. First off, the power of the conflict is determined by the number of players. So this number is going to change depending on how many people are actually playing the game, and that is the number that you were trying to beat in power, because you all have to work together in order to fend off these foreign invaders who are coming in, and if you can't do that, someone, or perhaps many people, are going to suffer the consequences. So this, again, just like with the Senate and the privilege cards, you are going to be doing this by playing your family cards and then flipping them over and seeing if you have been able to beat these numbers out on the card, depending on the number of players. And then whoever has played, if you are successful and you fended off the foreign invaders, the conflict card will be removed, but also whoever submitted the highest strength card is going to be get a reward, including things like putting out an estate in this case, in whatever country is indicated on the card. This is the symbol for the white country. Now, the thing is, if you fail, things get a bit worse. Then, depending on who has the, sometimes it's just a general effect, like this is going to be able to put out the either silent Sejm or black cloud pawns, which are going to reduce the power of a place in a certain country. Sometimes whoever played the lowest card is going to have to remove estates from certain countries and so forth. But regardless, if there are unresolved conflicts in an area of the board at the end of the conflict phase, that is when the partition markers are going to come out, and that means that that place is still contested, and that means that for the next round, until that is removed and the conflicts have been resolved, players cannot place estates in that area. So you're going to keep doing this. You're going to try to resolve all the different conflict cards. You're going to place your family cards out onto all the different conflicts, resolve them one at a time, and when that is done, then you go to a new round. You take all of your family cards back into hand, declare a new king, the king is dead, long live the king, then you do it all over again. Senate, Sejm for the privilege cards, and then the conflicts. And then at the end of 4 rounds, you're going to take a look at the board. There obviously will be many more estates out here than you currently see. See who has dominance and advantage in each of the different areas. Count up the points depending on the areas that you do have advantage and dominance in, the points for having control of these little fiefdoms, and also any Senate and privilege cards that you have that modify your points as well. And there's a couple other variables too, but that is a quick and dirty rundown of the Magnates. Try to have dominance over the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth. Let's go ahead and get to my final thoughts. The physical presentation of the Magnates is actually really great, and you don't really expect that from historical games like this, but everything just looks fantastic. The graphic design, the artwork. This is the type of game when people saw the board all laid out with our while I was playing with a group of players and other people were nearby watching or walking by, and they saw all of our estates out there. They saw this big, beautiful board and the card art. They're like, wow, that's like a spectacle of a game. And it's interesting because we, especially if you watch my channel a lot, I do unboxings for games with a lot of really intricate miniatures and a lot of really expensive bits, but you don't need all that to have a really great looking game, and I'm glad that people are finally catching on to that. I even like the sort of reused Renaissance, I don't know if it's Renaissance era, but the reused historical artwork on the cards, something that sticks out like a sore thumb in other games that I've played, but works really, really well with the design of the cards here. I might complain a little bit about the actual estate bits. At least they're not wooden cubes, but they are weird and small. But other things like the castle miniature and the, what is it, the silent Sejum, or I'm sorry, I forget the proper name for them, but the little dudes that that lower the power of the families in the area that they're in for conquest, the whole conquest phase, those look really great. So when you have everything out there together, it looks really, really good. So can't really say a bad thing about the presentation. The rule book is pretty solid. It looks more intimidating than it actually is at first. This is actually a relatively simple game. When I say simple, I mean simple to learn, simple to play and get into, but there is a surprising amount of depth in the gameplay itself, a lot for you to chew on here. And the reason for that is because this is mostly a deterministic game. There is not a lot of luck that you have no control over. There is some luck, the conquest cards that come out and the privilege cards that come out and the order in which the different king tokens will affect the Senate. These things are random. You don't necessarily have any control over what exactly comes out, but you have total control over how you react to them. As you saw in the overview, or didn't if you skipped it, you bastard. This game, every player has the same set of cards essentially. The artwork in the family is different, but you're playing the same numbered cards and essentially bidding, or however you want to say it, bidding or fighting on everything, and deciding what cards you want to put down in secret. It changes each time how that's going to work, but it's essentially the same process in each of the different phases. You're either bidding on cards for the Senate and choosing 3 of the 4 cards to bid for, or bidding on the privilege cards and bidding on all of them, and then whatever you have left over, you have to use the same hand for every phase, goes into the conquest phase. So a huge part of the strategy here is first off deciding how big you want to go in each phase, knowing that if you use your big cards in one phase, you're not going to have them for the other phase, which is going to make it that much harder to outbid your opponents. But what do your opponents really want? What are they really going to go for? You have to look at the cards that they already have in play, look at the countries that they already have estates in, because especially bidding on the Senate and the Sejum are going to give you more estates out on the board. So strategically knowing when to bid on certain things, to bid high, knowing that's going to help your position or hinder your opponent's decision, is a tremendously huge part of the game. And if you don't realize that going in, you're probably going to lose horribly unless everyone's in the same boat as you. Going for the conquest can also be critically important. It's probably more efficient to get estates out by bidding on the different cards, but if you go for the conquest, first off, you can ensure that you're not going to get totally hosed, because if you're in dead last place in one of the conquests as far as what you've contributed to the war effort, you are going to get hit with the negative ability, which sometimes might not be that bad, sometimes could be devastating. Losing estates from several different countries is not a fun thing. But sometimes you don't necessarily care if you want and let something tank in order to hurt your opponent's standing. There's the whole idea of the partitioning, and not which doesn't necessarily happen in every game. It only happened in actually one of the 3 games of this that we played. So it's not like a wholly ever-present threat. Along with the the meeples that will lower your power, it's not entirely common for those to come out, but it is another thing that you have to worry about, and that you can hope to try and manipulate to your favor as opposed to your opponent. So you're trying to help each other during the conquest stage, but sometimes the opposite of that, which is a pretty interesting dynamic to all of it. And because the game is mostly deterministic, it's really going to appeal to people who like that, just trying to outwit your opponent. Like, is he going to put a high card here? Should I waste this card now just to keep him from getting this? And what if he had the same thought as me? And trying that sort of like thinking one step ahead. What do they call it? The Vizzini effect, where it's like, well, if I know that you're going to put a high card here, so I'm going to put a low card here, but then you know that I'm going to put a low card here, so you're actually going to put a high card here. That whole thing is really interesting, and a lot of people are just going to love that. Having said all of that, for me personally, I found the game to be just a bit too dry for me. I think the historical context here is great, and that's another reason that people will love the game, especially if they want a historical game that is not a big, heavy war game, since this is moderate weight, I would say. But at the same time, while there is all this cool historical context and the game looks fantastic, I still felt detached from what was going on. It was put out cards, flip them over, see who won, take the card. By the time you get to, even though the game's not too long, I'd say it's definitely a reasonable length. By the time you're getting into the later rounds of the game, you're kind of like, all right, this happens, take your card, put the stakes here, boom, boom, boom. It starts to feel very mechanical, and I didn't feel connected to anything that was happening. The first round, it's not like that. It's like, long live the king, and I've got control of the Senate now, and I'm the chancellor, or whatever it might be. But for me, it just didn't last. I felt like maybe there should have been more luck in the game. There should have been more excitement to how the combats, quote-unquote, worked, because it didn't actually feel like combats or contests of strength all that much, and I think that's where I had an issue with it. Maybe that's the Ameritrash part of me that I can't fully silence, that wanted there to be more interaction, more like edge of your seat, push your luck type elements, because you're warring families. I felt like maybe there should have been more excitement there, even though there could possibly be things like, oh, I can't believe you put that card down and now I'm going to get hit with this bad penalty and so on. Those instances are not that common, and when they are, they're not terribly exciting. So what am I saying? Am I saying this is a bad game? Absolutely not. I think this is fantastically designed. I think that there are people who are watching this who are going to be like, sign me up right now. That is exactly the kind of game I wanted. Strategically outwitting my opponent, just pure getting into his mind and playing cards, and pure area control at its finest. For me, it didn't necessarily work, and I think there's other people who will think the same way as me, but if you're the target audience, definitely check this one out, because historically, as far as the appearance and as far as that back and forth with the card play, I haven't really played anything like it up to this point. That is the Magnates, A Game of Power from Phalanx.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.